So first of all, thank you very much, everyone, for inviting me here and for staying to the end. I probably would have left, but then that's just me. As Tim mentioned, most of my career was in Aberdeen. That's where I studied and did my PhD, working with the UK offshore oil and gas industry. I'm originally from Ireland and moved to Scotland, and then in 2001 moved to Canada. Alan didn't mention this, but at least in Nina, a small town in Ireland, not Dublin, where he came from, there's not a lot to do in Ireland in the 70s and 80s. So I spent a lot of my teenage years walking in the rain. Because you couldn't stay at home because your parents were on your case and listening to what you were doing, and there was nowhere to go, so, and it was always raining. So that's what I spent my life doing as a teenager. And I blame that for the fact that I can't think without walking. So one of the things it's going to be tough for the camera guy. I sort of was thinking about this all day, but when I stop thinking. So I have to usually warn my students about this, that I'm going to walk around a lot so that I can remember what I'm about to say. So that's one of the challenges. The second is, obviously, again, we've got another accented person, slightly different one, because I've sort of traveled around a bit, sort of part Scottish, part Irish, part Atlantic Canadian, so that can be a challenge. So I'll try my best to do it quietly and slowly and speak less quietly. But as I go through my presentation, and as I run out of time, I tend to speak quicker and quicker, and that can be a problem. So if it stops making sense, which could be I'm just going blah, 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 and I don't realize, then someone needs to wave and say, shut up, or slow down, or something. And Tim usually is good at doing those things. He always gives me a hard time, which I was blaming him for being the last slot. I thought that would be just revenge for the sparring matches we used to have. We used to be consultants competing at conferences that were run by IIR, and I was quite friendly with the organizer who used to sort of plan them. So when she'd phone me up to ask, I would always say, well, who I wanted to be before or after. And actually, there was a couple of DuPont consultants who I always wanted to be after because I knew what they were going to say, and I had my slides set up to give them a hard time. So I thought Tim was doing that to me, but apparently not. Apparently not. I am currently the CN Professor of Safety Culture. It's a 5-year position that CN Rail is funding to do basically outreach work on safety culture. How can we develop tools to enable organizations to create a positive safety culture? I've been studying and working on safety culture for 20 years. And in many ways, I sort of think about safety culture as a relationship. It's what I've studied for all of my academic and work career. And it's been a pretty torrid relationship, I have to be honest with you. There's been times when, you know, I hated the concept of safety culture and thought it was the biggest gimmick in the world. There's been times when I thought it was the solution to all known problems in mankind. And I'm sort of in between now. We're sort of in a more sort of mature phase of our relationship where we understand our strengths and weaknesses and sort of work within that sort of paradigm. So since 2013 and until 2018, the role I've got now within St. Mary's is to go around and promote the understanding of the concept of safety culture and develop tools and techniques that will enable organizations to promote a positive safety culture. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my background. I'm going to talk a bit about some sort of safety culture concepts. I'll talk about some work we did looking at major offshore accidents and some of the conclusions we came from that. And then I'm going to sort of finish off a little bit with trying to challenge you about measuring some of the things that matter. So first of all, my background. So I went to Canada in 2001, and I was actually recruited by St. Mary's University because of my offshore oil and gas experience. That was one of the reasons why they hired me, because in the sort of early 2000s, Nova Scotia was going to be the new area for offshore development. At that point, they had just connected their first, they had one rig operating in a gas field, and there was lots of optimism about the future for Nova Scotia was in the offshore oil and gas industry. Now we've got 2 rigs, and we've sort of realized that there is probably not a whole pile of stuff out there. So when I arrived, I realized pretty quickly I needed to move beyond the offshore oil and gas industry because coming from Aberdeen, there wasn't one in Nova Scotia. So I have diversified from healthcare, aviation, construction, nuclear industry, the rail industry. So one of the things that's been good about this is by working with different industries, you learn a lot more about the culture and how to promote a positive safety culture, and able to sort of see the commonality across industries in terms of the challenges they have and how they come up with those solutions. So I work across industries because the issue I work with, culture, is the same across those domains and dimensions, and you come up with some neat sort of strategies. I think it's interesting, earlier, what gets people into safety. There's always been a reason why, and Fons spoke about it and Fiona spoke about it earlier, that what is it that got you into safety? And nearly every safety person has got a reason why they became passionate about safety. What is it that motivates them to try to ensure and improve the safety of others? And for me, I was an undergraduate student in the late 80s, just after Piper Alpha happened, and you couldn't be and live in Aberdeen without an awareness of what that disaster did to Aberdeen and the impact it had on the community. And I was studying psychology, and I was planning, like probably most people who studied psychology at the time, to become a clinical psychologist. And one of the good things I think about psychology is that you have to get some experience before you can get into the training programs to become a clinical psychologist. And I went and got that experience and realized it wasn't for me, that I didn't have what it took to work in that domain as a career, which was very useful, although a bit depressing. Right? So I end up sort of finishing that and wondering what I'm going to do. And I was at a conference, and I was in my early 20s, and someone was presenting some of the analysis of Piper. I'm sitting there and I'm listening to them, and as a pretty arrogant 20-year-old, I said, whatever they're saying is completely wrong. They've misunderstood what really was important in terms of Piper, that fundamentally it was a psychological issue was where the challenge was at, and that we actually needed to work on it from that domain. And that's what got me into safety, was to understand why disasters like Piper happened and how can we prevent them in the future. And in many ways, that's what I've been working on since that date. And the thing about disasters, and I spent a lot of my time reading disaster reports, is that they are very common in terms of the causes are always fundamentally cultural. So this is a Texas city, this is Deepwater Horizon, Fukushima. When we look at the major disasters that have happened around the world, they have always been cultural in nature. It's not about the technology. The technology was always there to be managed, would have managed the hazard. There was processes in place to manage that hazard. But the people running the system did not follow or use those procedures in the way they were intended. And these weren't simple failures of individuals, but systemic failures that corrupted the entire system. So when we look at disasters, we understand that culture is the driver. I thought it would be helpful, although it's a bit late as the last thing, but to actually define what we mean by safety culture. So this comes from the Axini report, which was written in the early 90s, to say safety culture is the product of individual and group values and attitudes, competencies and patterns of behavior that determine commitment to, style and proficiency of an organization's health and safety programs. And what's the key thing about that? It's about our group values that determine our commitment to and the effectiveness of our programs. Having a positive safety culture is not an optional extra. It fundamentally determines how safe you are. To see it as something that we would like to have is just not an option. It's like saying, well, we'd like to be a bit safe, right? You have to have a positive safety culture in order for your safety systems to work effectively. If you don't have one, they don't work. At one point in time when I was working as a consultant, we had a marketing guy come and give us some advice. And you know, he would come up and we'd meet with him every month and we'd talk about things. And whatever problem or idea we came up with, he was always able to break it down into a 2-by-2 matrix. And After a while, I noticed he did this, and I was a bit mischievous. And I would try to dream up things that didn't fit in a 2x2 matrix, just to be a bit annoying. Anyway, I've got over that. But what's really quite interesting, he could always do it. And what I've decided is, for you to actually understand something, you should be able to break it down into a 2x2 matrix. So I always try to do this. So for safety culture, the two paradigms, you can have a safe culture or an unsafe culture. You can have a strong culture or you can have a weak culture. So those are the sort of categories in terms of how we can break down a safety culture. So when we talk about safety culture, what we're often referring to is a strong, safe culture. In that you have these, you maybe can't quite see this, but these are little faces in the middle for people. And what we're saying is that in a safe culture, people's behavior is very consistent and it's very much in that safe zone. There's very little variability in people's behavior. Everybody does the same thing, and people behave consistently, and it's all very much right within that safe zone. Does that make sense? And if somebody came in and wanted to behave in this part, people would very quickly advise them that that was not safe and that it was not something that was acceptable. And if they persisted with not behaving in a safe way in that environment, people would become more and more aggressive in their approach to say this is not acceptable behavior. And ultimately, they would probably bully that person out of that team or that organization because it would not be acceptable to behave over here in this context because the group norms would be very strong and it's intolerable for someone to behave differently. Does that make sense? So this is a strong, safe culture. In many ways, what we're looking for in an organization. Another one is where you've got a weak culture, but it's safe. And this is where there's a lot of individual variability and people do their own thing. Healthcare is very much in this domain. Often a lot of healthcare that's delivered is safe, but it's actually not a very strong culture in some contexts, so people do their own thing. And a weak culture is never as safe as a strong, safe culture, but you can see that because the individuals do their own thing, they're broadly all safe, so you happen to have safe outcomes. So you can have a weak culture and still have safe outcomes. You're not quite ever going to be as safe as this, but you can still be safe. And what's interesting is that if I came into this culture and was behaving in an unsafe way, that would be okay. No one would mind. You want to do it in an unsafe way, that's your choice. I want to do it in my safe way. I do it my way, you do it your way. Does that make sense? So the strength of the culture is important. You should be able to see it's pretty easy to go from a safe, weak culture to an unsafe culture. Different people change, circumstances change, we move to this domain. And then finally, we have a strong negative culture. And in this context, if you came in here and wanted to behave in a safe manner, you would also be ostracized and bullied and removed from the organization. It would not be acceptable to be safe. I don't know what it's like in Denmark, but in Canada, this happens in the roofing industry. Right? So commercial roofers are very small companies. They're operating for individual customers. It's pretty expensive. Time is everything. So you don't wear a safety harness. You don't have scaffolding because that will slow you down. So if you turned up out of community college with your training, with your safety harness on and asked where the hook was going to go, they would laugh first. They would think that was sort of cute and funny. If you tried to persist, then you would be fired. Right? Because that's not acceptable in this culture. Being safe is not acceptable. Now, the purpose of this is to illustrate that culture varies on two dimensions, the extent to which it's positive and the extent to which it is strong. And in your organization, you will have some variation of this. So companies tend not to have these particular dimensions, but you can sit on that scale. So how positive is your culture and how strong it is? Clearly, going from here to here is going to be a real challenge, right? People are going to have to leave the organization for that to happen. But the process of making the culture change is crucial. So I'm going to just briefly put this diagram up. This is from a report that was written in Canada from the National Energy Board. But what we talk about is why is culture important and what's important. So you need to look at these threats: production pressure, complacency, normalization of deviance, which is basically it becomes acceptable to break the rules, and tolerance of inadequate systems. So what we know about culture is that these cultural threats exist in your organization to varying degrees. And part of understanding your culture is to understand the extent to which these threats exist in your organization. And you need to be able to know that they're there and come up with strategies to manage those threats. And it is through doing that you're able to improve your culture. So we took these dimensions, and these dimensions originally came from James Reason, and we added in production pressure. And we did a review of 17 offshore disasters that occurred over the last 30 years that we were able to get public inquiry reports in English. So that was our criteria. And we analyzed those disasters to see whether these threats were present. So in 14 of the 17 disasters, we were able to find evidence of these cultural threats being a fundamental cause of the disaster. Now, this was identified by the public inquiry reports. So the one that turned out to be the most frequently identified was tolerance of inadequate systems and resources, where people used systems and equipment that was not fit for the job and that was not acceptable. Pat, at the beginning, talked about being able to turn back after 200 meters, or being able to, when you had sunk costs, when you were halfway through a project and you just continued going. Sometimes we're so committed to doing something that we're willing to accept that the system is inadequate, but we continue. And in this context, often people have spent a long time not being able to get the system to work in practice, and there's poor maintenance, and we just expect things not to work. So tolerance of inadequate systems is one of the big threats that's out there. At the moment, your offshore rigs may have some deficiencies in place, and to what extent are people willing to say, this is not acceptable? I was sitting with a company recently, and they were telling me a story about how they found on their installation, the employees had made up T-shirts which said, "It is what it is," which is basically saying, this stuff doesn't work properly and you just got to accept it. Now that's a huge threat in a high-hazard environment, that we've got stuff that doesn't work and you just got to suck it up. And to a certain extent, that's probably the biggest threat that's out there on a day-to-day basis, because the employees who go offshore are out there to do a job, and they want to be successful. And sometimes the equipment is inadequate, so we try to make it work and make it do and make something work properly. And the leadership role in this context is to say, no, that's not acceptable. We're going to take the hit from a cost perspective to make sure we get it right. Normalization of deviance is where we break the rules, we don't even know that we're breaking them anymore. Right? So if somebody comes out and observes you and you're got a senior manager there, they're still going to break the rules because we're not actually breaking the rules, this is just the way we do it around here. Right? It becomes an acceptable practice. And the one I'm going to talk a little bit more later about is complacency, which is not, it can be I don't care about safety, but more commonly what the issue is that we actually feel we're invulnerable, that in some way we are different and we are special, and therefore the rules don't apply to us. And I think that's probably one of the bigger threats that we have in the offshore oil and gas industry just now, and I'm going to sort of talk about that a bit more. So if you're trying to manage these threats, what you need to do is have a positive safety culture, which we talk about leadership, vigilance, empowerment and accountability, and resilience. So the idea is that your positive safety culture is your shield against these threats that are ever present in your organization. And the quality of your positive safety culture and the extent to which you are able to do that determines the extent to which you can manage these threats that are going to be present in your organization. There's always going to be these threats that are going to be present, and the challenge to you is how do you go about managing them? So how are we doing time-wise? Okay, well, worse than I thought. So I'm going to pause there just for a second. So what I've tried to give you is just a quick overview of why safety culture is important, the evidence that it's important in terms of major hazard risk, and some of the main dimensions you need to think about in terms of managing those hazards. One of the things that organizations have struggled with is to adopt a systematic approach to promoting a positive safety culture. So one of the frameworks or models that I've developed recently is a way for an organization to look at the creating of a positive safety culture. And it's quite interesting that many of the speakers today have talked about a vision. And I'm often surprised by companies who talk about cultural issues or who talk about safety culture, but never actually articulate what sort of culture they want. What is the vision that they're trying to create? I used, in presentations in the past, have a slide from Ron Westrom, which talked about 3 types of cultures. Pathological, bureaucratic, and generative. And the pathological is the sort of really negative. I think Alan really sort of described it as sort of warfare, that sort of really negative culture. Bureaucratic is where we do things, we live by the systems. And generative is where we work collaboratively together. And I used to get people to look at the descriptors and say, don't tell me what culture you currently live in, but tell me which one you want to be in. And universally, everybody would say they would want to be in a generative culture. Everybody wants to be treated with respect. Everybody wants to live in a positive environment. And when you talk about your vision for a safety culture, everybody in your organization should look at that vision and say, that's where I want to be. We may not be there now. We may never get there. But that's the place I want to live. You need to have a very clear vision of the type of an organization you're trying to create. And it can't be a top-down vision where it's all employees will follow all the rules and do exactly what they're told. Because A, that wouldn't be a great culture, and B, it's not something that other people are going to look at and say, I want to live there, right? So what you want to do is have a vision statement that is created by a group of people that everyone can look at and say, this is who we want to be, this is the culture that we're trying to create. And this vision needs to be written in your language, in your terms, and on your employees. And it may change over time, but it's a vision of where we're trying to go. That vision will create responsibilities. So if you have a vision of the type of culture we're trying to create, then different groups within the organization will have different responsibilities to get us to that vision. And these people will be managers, supervisors, contractor managers, employees. Everybody will have a role to reach us to that vision. We get there, the roles will be different for different people, so managers will have the role of showing commitment, for example. Employees will have the role of being actively engaged in safety. So the responsibilities flow from the vision. If we have responsibilities, then we need plans and actions to be able to realize those responsibilities. We need to be able to tell people what to do to be able to achieve those responsibilities. So if a manager's responsibility is about demonstrating commitment, well, we're probably going to need a plan to train that manager to be able to demonstrate commitment. We're maybe going to have a plan where we do worksite visits so they get an opportunity to demonstrate their commitment. And we may need to have a plan to measure and monitor the extent to which managers are living up to those responsibilities. The plans are processes that we put in place to promote a positive safety culture, flow from our responsibilities, which flow from our vision. We're going to do some assessment. We're going to assess the extent to which we're actually living up to those plans, the extent to which those plans are creating the desired culture that we're trying to achieve. We're going to do some audit, and then we're also going to review and refine our system so that we have a continuous process. And from my perspective, this model or framework will help organizations come up with a systematic approach to creating a positive safety culture. And you should at least recognize, I think, that this is basically taking a safety management system approach and just changing the words so that it fits with culture. So it should be integrated into existing processes and practices that you already have in place. The thing that I think many companies struggle with is they do loads and loads of things to promote safety. So they do leadership training, they do worksite visits, they do audits, but they don't necessarily put it all together into one system to say, this is what we're doing to create a positive safety culture in our organization. And this framework hopefully enables organizations to do that. So I'm going to go back. So that's the improvement approach, right? So my hope, the takeaway, all the other stuff up to this point was just to get to this model really, was to say to you, If you want to have a positive safety culture, you need to have a plan to get one. Hoping for it is not going to work. You know, I might like to be 6'4", but it ain't going to happen, right? You actually sometimes, companies seem to have the same approach to safety culture. They would like to be different, but it doesn't work that way. The other challenge, I think, is I'm going to go back to the threat around complacency. And one of the threats that's associated with where the oil and gas industry is just now in terms of safety. So this is OGP data. I looked actually to try and get Danish data, but I wasn't able to access it. I asked a whole bunch of people. I asked a colleague of mine, Jan Skriver, who is Danish and does a lot of work in this sector, to see if he could find Danish data. But because the regulator changed role in January of this year, it seems that all the data just disappeared, right? So you don't have any publicly available data, at least. And the sector is relatively small, so it would be difficult to do it. So what we've got on the blue line is the total recordable injury rate from 2005 to 2013, and the blue dotted line is the trend line. And then we've got the fatal accident rate, which is on a different scale, but is the trend line again. You can see that what's happened internationally in the oil and gas industry is that over the last 10 years, lost time injury rates have been decreasing systematically over time, right? But nothing has happened systematically in terms of fatality rates. So we're injuring less people, but we're killing just as many. And my challenge to you is that safety improvement? And the answer is no. I'm sorry. It is not improvement. Not injuring people is a good thing, but if you're still killing as many people as you were 10 years ago, you are not any safer. Now, I work in the Canadian sort of sector, which is about the same size as the Danish sector. Relatively small industry, and therefore the numbers are often hard to manage when you've got small numbers of employees. One incident here or there can have a dramatic impact on the outcome statistics. And the other thing is, thankfully, because fatalities are still relatively rare, you can believe that you are safer than you really are because you haven't had a fatality recently. And that was the case in the Canadian sector until we had the Cougar helicopter crash in 2009 where 17 people died. So we really need to not be lulled into a false sense of security because our injury rates are dropping. So that is my sort of challenge to you to an extent is, yes, focus on not injuring people, that's a good thing, but just because you haven't injured someone doesn't mean you're safe. That's the challenge. Okay, so what we're looking for is good indicators, which are accurate, predictive, and current. And I'm just going to leave you with this new idea that we've been working on. So we just published the report in April, so I can share that with you. What we've developed with the oil industry in Canada is a series of 20 safety culture metrics. And the idea behind these metrics is that you can get a sense of the health of your safety culture based on the systems that are in place within your organization. So you can track the health of your safety culture using these indicators. Now, you probably wouldn't use all 20, but you would use a sample of them to track the health of your safety culture. And a bit like Tim mentioned earlier, we're not counting the number of things you do, we're counting the quality in which you do them. So we talk about leadership, we talk about empowerment and accountability as way to measure the quality. So for example, many organizations collect stop cards of some description. Yes? And we often count the number of stop cards submitted, with the idea being more stop cards submitted, the better the culture. And then we decide, well, it's my performance target to have X number of stop cards, so now I'm going to require my employees to submit X number of stop cards. And what happens in that context is that the quality goes down, where people are writing stop cards, I saw Bob, he didn't have his laces tied, I told Bob to tie his laces, right? Bob didn't exist, the laces weren't untied, I wrote it in the toilet. That is not a quality card. And what we've tried to do is to say, let's look at the quality in which our systems produce outcomes and compare that over time. So the other thing that the oil industry does when it gets a performance indicator is it manages the indicator. Right? LTI is a particularly good example of this. Right? Before, when we started to use LTI as a performance indicator, if someone got injured and they went off and they had a 3-day injury, that was the way it went. They went to hospital. Now, if someone breaks their arm, they're choppered on shore, we put a pin in it, we cast them up that day, and we ship them back to the office the next morning on morphine, and they make the coffee, or they sleep. But it wasn't an LTI. We broke the person's arm in 2 places, but no, it's not an LTI. You have to practically be killed now to be classified as an LTI. Because we created an LTI as a performance indicator, and people chase the performance indicator. So we created these metrics in a way to manage the performance indicator. So it's a comparative. It either got better or worse in comparison to the previous time frame. So it makes it more difficult to mess with it. So if you keep sort of wanting to always be improving, then it will become very suspicious, and it's quite difficult. You just escalate yourself to a situation where you can't manage it. So the idea is it's self-limiting in the sense of how much you can manage it, how much you can mess with the indicator. And the other thing about indicators, safety indicators, particularly leading safety indicators, is that this is aimed at senior managers. And senior managers need things that are really simple. So LTI was simple, more of it was bad, less of it was good. This is equally simple. 0 is no change, negative is negative, and positive is positive. So even a senior manager could understand it. And that is the sort of logic of this sort of process. It does involve people actually looking at the systems that they've got in place and putting them in practice. And my challenge, I suppose, to you to think about it, if you're wanting to collaborate on something, as an industry, you could create, because we're doing this in Alberta just now, a standard set of safety culture metrics that you would track and measure as a group. So if collaboration is something that you want to do, I think you need an activity to collaborate on. You already collect this information, but you just need to do it in a way that focuses on the quality, and then you can look at where your culture is going at an industry-based level and at a company-based level, and then you can improve. If you're interested in doing that, I'm happy to send people the information. This is not secret in any shape or form. The results are out now. And what we want, or what I want, is for organizations to use these metrics to help them improve and help them improve their culture. And I'm going to finish there with a quote, which is going back to the complacency. It won't happen to me. When anyone asks me of how I could best describe my experience in nearly 40 years at sea, I merely say uneventful. I've never been in an accident of any sort worth speaking about. I never saw a wreck. I've never been wrecked, nor was I ever in a predicament that threatened to end in any form of disaster. And that was Captain Edward Smith, the captain of the Titanic. So thank you very much for your attention.